Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to introduce myself. So my name is Rose White, and I am a sociology PhD student in New York City, but I'm also a knitter, and I have been for over 15 years. And I owned a small yarn store in Brooklyn called Yarnivore. And when I saw the call for papers for this conference, they mentioned guerrilla knitting. And when I put in a proposal for the other talk that I gave, I mentioned, well, if you like, I could give a talk on guerrilla knitting. And Jens and some of the other people said, yes, yes, please. So here I am. And thank you. So as you'll see, the history of guerrilla knitting is actually very short, and it's entertaining, and I'm going to present that to you with some pictures that are very fun. But in preparing the talk and over the last few days and thinking really hard about being here and points of comparison between the two worlds, I decided that I wanted to add some more material that I thought would be very interesting for everyone, whether you knit or not. So let's get started. Here's a good example of what people are doing in terms of guerrilla knitting, just knit graffiti. So here's a sign welcoming people to Manhattan that has a beautiful piece of knitting on it. And this is in Chicago, and somebody has knitted on a tree and decorated it with a flower. I believe it's a dead tree, and so now they have made it, much prettier. This is in, oh, now I don't remember. Oh, this is in New Zealand, and this is somebody's photographs of a bunch of different tags that they found in their area. This one's my favorite. This is in Stockholm, and I love the images of the knitter putting together the piece and putting it on the anchor. I'm going to talk for a little while, I'll leave that up. So almost every time I've told somebody that I would be talking about knitting at the C3 conference, they've been very surprised. And they said, well, do you really mean knitting? Maybe you mean networking? Or is there a translation problem? And so, no, obviously I am talking about knitting. But I do want to expand from guerrilla knitting and talk about geek knitting, and also to look at how the development of knitting over the last few centuries has a number of important parallels between, with the development of hacking and also open source programming. So, very recently, just in the last 10 or 15 years, the internet, first through the mailing list called the Knit List, and then through blogs and websites, has changed the experience of modern knitters and is exposing tech people, conceptual artists, and other geeks to knitting at the same time that it's exposing knitters to all of our weirdness in ways that they hadn't really gotten a chance to see before. Knitting itself is not very old. There are sort of folkloric things that people say about knitting, like, oh, we've been knitting for tens of thousands of years. And that's just a lie. People have actually only been knitting since the Renaissance. There's some examples of fabrics that look knitted, but when they're taken apart, they're actually done with a technique called nalbinding, which is a sort of Scandinavian technique involving multiple strands of yarn and what looks like a darning needle. And so that's not what we think of as knitting, where there's a single strand of yarn that makes up the entire garment. And the thing that's interesting about that from a computing point of view is that when knitting developed, it was proprietary knowledge. So the transmission of the knowledge of knitting happened really from sort of the Middle East, and then along the same lines that brought classical learning back to Europe in the Renaissance. And then in Italy, there were knitting guilds. So if you want to think about them, the guilds as being like trade unions, or as being like certificate programs saying that you're certified in a particular language or in a particular networking technique. There were these guilds, and they very heavily, they kept their knowledge very secret. And so knitting was not something that people did at home. Knitting was something that men did for pay. And they did this for the Queen of England, or for important people in their province. But as it turns out, knitting isn't very hard. And so people were able to reverse engineer knitting. And so that knowledge that had previously been proprietary and kept in guilds, I'm going to come back to that one, got dispersed into the community. So as we so often say, if you build something and you put DRM on it, people are just going to break it. And so if you put knitted objects out in the world, somebody can look at that knitted object and figure out how it's made. And as Elizabeth Zimmerman says, knitting isn't hard. All you need to become a good knitter are wool, needles, hands, and slightly below average intelligence. Of course, superior intelligence, such as yours and mine, is an advantage. And I will come back to Elizabeth Zimmerman a little later. So at that point, just after the Renaissance, just as the Industrial Revolution was beginning, knitting sort of had two divergent paths. So knitting frames and knitting machines allowed knitting to be something that could just be purchased, that would be produced industrially. But also homemakers, usually women and children, learned how to knit so that they could do things themselves. And they were usually making socks or mittens or other very small things. They weren't really making like sweaters and larger garments. Ganzis, the sweater on the left, and the Aran sweater on the right, those were developed in the late 19th century. Fair Isle knitting developed sort of at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Again, in terms of folklore, you could actually find printed in reputable seeming books up until 10 or 20 years ago, stories about how Aran knitting had existed for centuries, and that the different cables were how families would identify their drowned sailors at sea. And so this idea that these cables were a kind of code that families had knitted into the garments. And so it's all completely false. So when people talk about Wikipedia not being reliable, these were books published by Random House and other presumably reputable publishers. That's all been disputed and revised, and so we have a clearer history of knitting now. So there are these beautiful Fair Isle sweaters knit in two colors. I'm gonna put the pretty picture back up while I talk for a moment. Over the course then of the next 50 years, one thing that happened is that there was still a small tradition of this home knitting where knowledge was passed on between individuals. But there were also publications that tried to codify knitting patterns. And there was a sort of trend toward trying to make the patterns as distinct as possible, and also to make them proprietary. And so knitting patterns were widely published by the yarn companies, but for their specific yarn. They would withhold any information that would help a knitter make an object in another yarn. So information that you might need would be, how many meters are there in a ball of this yarn? That wouldn't be printed on it. How many total meters of yarn do you need to make the project? They wouldn't tell you. They would say you need 8 balls of our yarn named Zephyr to make a project. How many stitches you would knit to each inch, which is gauge, and which would let you figure out how to size your pattern, they would withhold that information as well. And so this is a very proprietary system where they would say, using our yarn and using these size needles, cast on this many stitches and do it exactly the way we tell you. And so over a period of decades, the commercial knitting industry managed to alienate millions of knitters from the understanding that they were in possession of the means and the mode of production. So these are the sort of things that were available, and you can see that this is Bear brand yarn. And the patterns that would be included here would say, use our yarn. And then by the 60s, most available yarn was acrylic or polyester. It wasn't wool or cotton or other things that are actually nice to touch. So then there was another schism in knitting. At the sort of end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, modern Western feminists decided that knitting was a tool of the patriarchy, and that women were being kept down by housework and by handicrafts, and that this sort of thing was something that just wouldn't do, and that they didn't want to have anything to do with it anymore. At the same time, there was a different movement going on with the Whole Earth Catalog, Mother Earth News, a publisher called Interweave Press. And so hippies actually kept some knowledge of knitting going at the same time that feminists were saying, no, we don't want to have anything to do with it. So there was actually a spinning wheel that you could buy from the Whole Earth Catalog. And they gave information about where to buy knitting and other textile supplies. At this moment, we have a heroine who sort of steps in. And we can really call her an geek. Her name is Elizabeth Zimmerman. And she's the woman on the left there. And I apologize, this is not the geekiest picture that exists of her. There's a lovely picture of her knitting while riding on the back of her husband's motorcycle that I really wanted to bring you, and I couldn't find it anywhere. I know that I've seen it, and now none of us can remember what book that's in. So she was commissioned to make a sweater early in her professional knitting career. And it was an Aran sweater, like the white cabled sweater I showed you before. And she did a wonderful job of it, and it was knit all in one piece using traditional knitting techniques. And when she gave it to the company that had commissioned it, they rewrote the pattern. And they rewrote it so that it would be knitted in 4 pieces, and using the kind of proprietary language that I discussed before. Whereas her feeling was that, you can substitute whatever yarn you want, and you can do it however you want. And she was disgusted by this process of them taking her intellectual property and screwing it up. And then, they kept her name on it, but she was really pissed off. And so she started her own publishing company. And she would tell people that you are the boss of your knitting, and you can make your knitting do anything you want it to do. Which was a very different message than what people were getting from other directions. In her knitting patterns, she would talk about blind followers and thinking knitters. And so she would say that if you really needed her to, she would write out a pattern for you with all of the numbers in it. But what she preferred to do was to write a pattern that said, using your own yarn, knit up a little swatch, figure out what it does, figure out how many stitches an inch you get, figure out what you're going to make with it, and then here are some ways to design your own pattern, which is a very hands-on kind of idea that you control what's going on. And when you think about it, you're taking needles and string and stitch by stitch constructing a garment. There's no reason why you shouldn't have absolute control over that entire process. And that's something that had been taken away from people. The comparison that I'd like to make really is between Linux and Windows. And so I think of Linux as being a folk culture. Certainly my own exposure to Linux has been learned by word of mouth and mailing lists and websites. I'm going to admit now actually that it is embarrassing to me. My home machine runs Ubuntu, and my hard drive